Okay, we are live. We have a great show coming up because we have two very, very excellent guests. Of course, we have Alexander Mercouris in London.
Mhm.
We have the one and only Gonzalo Lira joining us, and we have the magnificent Brian Berletic. Gonzalo, Brian, how are you? I will have all your information down below in the description box as well as a pinned comment as well. But how are both of you gentlemen doing today?
Oh, well, you said that you're going to have two excellent guests, and I only see Brian here. Who else is the second? It's great to be here as always, gentlemen. Thank you very much for having me on. I appreciate it.
And likewise, thank you so much. And I'm always happy to share the screen with Gonzalo as well.
Fantastic. Let's say a quick hello to everyone that is watching us on Rockfin, on Odyssey, on Rumble. Hit that like button on Rumble, everybody, and on the Duran.locals.com. Hello to everyone in the locals chat. How is everyone doing? And to everybody that is watching us on YouTube, hello to our moderators, William, Justice. Who else is moderating? I'm moderating. Gonzalo's moderating. William is moderating. And I think Valies. Hey, Valies. Good to see you. Valies is with us as well. Reckless Abandon. How are you doing, Reckless Abandon?
Hey, Reckless. Good to see you.
Good to see you. All right. Thank you to our moderators. You guys are the best. We love our moderators.
Well, it feels like the band is getting back together again. Whenever I do these shows, I figure I'm the guitar player because I'm the only smoker, and Brian, he's the drummer, and Alex is the bass player, and Alexander is the front man. He's our Freddie Mercury.
Well,
So,
on that, let's pass it over to Freddie. Let's pass it over to Alexander.
To the front man.
And Alexander, the topic is Ukraine, Bakhmut. Lots going on. Lots of things that we don't know as well, and a lot of questions as to why recent moves have been made and why recent decisions have been taken. So, Alexander, Brian, Gonzalo, I pass it off to you guys.
Yeah, and can I say, what better guests to discuss all this with than the two guests we have, and it's a joy to have you both, can I just say. Well, it's a very, very interesting and very complicated time, because this battle of Bakhmut, I think it's becoming actually more complicated. Don't want to suggest it's, at its end point. It might be, but we now have a situation where the Russians, I stress it's the Russians, are starting to say the place is in a cauldron. In other words, it's effectively operationally surrounded. That doesn't mean that there's a Russian soldier, Wagner operations group soldier, standing on every meter of ground that's around Bakhmut. What they mean by that is that the Russians can now launch artillery strikes on the main roads. The main roads are now becoming impossible to use in any sustained way. And of course, we also have the Russian artillery can strike apparently pretty much any Ukrainian group of people, large group of people, vehicles that are trying to enter Bakhmut across the mud and the country lanes. And the British Ministry of Defence is telling us today that the weather conditions are turning bad, that these country lanes and these fields are becoming extremely muddy because there's a lot of rain. That's what the British Ministry of Defence is saying, and they're hardly likely to be a pro-Russian side. Now, at the same time, we're getting lots and lots of rumours about a possible Ukrainian attempt to break into Bakhmut. In other words, that there's still large numbers of Ukrainian troops outside this surrounded area. They're thinking of trying to punch a hole in. We'll see whether that happens. There's also lots of rumors. Go on.
No, I just wanted to ask you about that rumor, because quite frankly, it sounds to me insane that they would try to punch in again and put more troops into a losing cause. I mean, this is like the the perennial gambler who keeps doubling down on a losing bet, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. Well, I'm very glad you mentioned the doubling down comes from gambling, because when Rishi Sunak talked about the West needing to double down over Ukraine, I made precisely that point. And a number of people came back to me and said, no, that isn't true. And I checked out, and it is, in fact, from gambling. But anyway, put that aside. Yes, you may be right, but let's talk about that in a moment, because there's Bakhmut. There's a counterattack talked about Bakhmut. There is a larger Ukrainian counterattack that some people are now talking about, and all kinds of preparations, and there's a lot about it in The Economist. And then we're getting all kinds of diplomatic activity. We got the Chinese foreign minister traveling to Moscow a short time ago, causing all sorts of angst whilst he was in Munich. He wasn't the Chinese foreign minister, but Wang Yi, the man in charge of Chinese foreign policy. Xi Jinping is apparently heading to Moscow very soon. And on top of that, we've had this extraordinary, most mysterious trip by Olaf Scholz to Washington. So he goes to Washington, no German media with him, no German businessmen with him. He arrives in Washington. He's driven directly to the White House. He has a meeting which lasts for an hour, a bit more than an hour, with Biden. No aides apparently are present, no officials. Apparently, I'm not even sure whether there were interpreters there. So this is a pure one-to-one meeting. There's no press conference, and Scholz flies back to Berlin. And we don't know what was actually discussed. The White House readout is extremely uninformative, but all sorts of strange things going on all around us. So I think this is a rather complex situation. And I think the best place to start, actually, apart from Bakhmut, where we can talk about the situation, is also that program you did recently, Brian, about the latest Pentagon weapons delivery, because it's clear that in Europe, we are now, our cupboard in terms of weapons is empty. It's always ultimately, I mean, 80%, 90% of the weapons Ukraine has received have come from the US, or so it seems to me. And it's now increasingly looking as if the US cupboard is also starting to get empty too. And I can't help but think that on the battleground, things are starting to be shaped around this. On the one hand, we've had Bakhmut, which has had terrible effects on Ukraine. I mean, it's thousands of people have lost their lives there. We have this talk of the offensive, and we have all these diplomatic activities going on the side, the Ukrainian offensive. Note, it's always a Ukrainian offensive. Nobody talks about a Russian offensive. There's been no official announcement from Russia about an offensive. So I have to say, coming back to Gonzalo's point about doubling down, it looks to me as if we could perhaps change the gambling metaphor, and it perhaps last throw might be, where these offensives are concerned, both the attempt to break back into Bakhmut, perhaps this spring, summer offensive that Ukraine might be about to launch. Maybe we're close to the last throw. If it doesn't turn out, then what? And then that's me. That's where I start. That's where I stop, rather. Brian, is the cupboard running empty? I mean, are we getting to the point where we can only provide the Ukrainians with dribs and drabs? It's no longer realistic for us to sustain the kind of level of military supplies that we have been doing up to now.
I think we've been watching that deplete for months now. We've watched these packages shrink in size and in the variety of weapon systems that they're sending. They've been talking about a shortage of artillery shells for months and months now. This was something that from the very beginning they were not prepared to do. And as they're sending these shells to Ukraine, that was it. There weren't more coming that they would be able to eventually send Ukraine. That's coming in several years. And even the expansion of artillery shell production that they've been talking about in the United States, in 2 or 3 years when that is finished, if it is finished, it's still not going to be enough. It's only going to be able to sustain the levels that Ukraine is losing at right now. It will not be able to match or exceed what Russia is producing. So there's that. And the last couple of packages that the U.S. has sent, one of them was all just contracts for things to eventually be built someday. And the last one, they were listing these different munitions that they usually include quantities for, and the quantities were missing. And they've done that the last couple of packages. And the reason why is because those numbers have been getting smaller. People were paying attention to these numbers, and they don't want to list the numbers because they're getting embarrassingly small, I think. It's not as if Russia is waiting for Pentagon press releases to figure out how much aid the U.S. is sending. They have their own means to determine that. This is about maintaining the illusion of perpetual support for Ukraine for everybody else. And so I think that is a huge problem that they're finally going to have to face. They're not going to be able to hide from it anymore.
I mean, I've always heard throughout my life from military people that, amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. And it's turned out to be, absolutely true in this war. I mean, we're struggling apparently to find tanks. I have to say, I'm shocked, actually, if I have to say, how unprepared the West has been for this war, how utterly run down Western militaries have been for so long, for so many years, apparently, how run down our production capacities are. But, I was involved, as I've said many times, I've done work on the industrial side, and I listened to things like the sort of things that people like Joseph Borrell and others say about, cranking up artillery production, munitions production. And I think these people do not understand that you can't just conjure things like this up by throwing money. It doesn't work like this. You have to set up a whole production chain. You have to train people. You have to sort out the factory space. You have to organize suppliers. It takes time to do this, even if you're talking about something as relatively straightforward as shells. It's not quite as easy as I think people like some of the US officials and some of the EU officials appear to think.
Yeah, I think that there are two issues here. And both issues are basically miscalculations by the Washington State Department people, the usual suspects, Victoria Nuland, Anthony Blinken. And the two misjudgments were as follows. Number one, they were convinced that the sanctions back in the spring of last year would completely cripple the Russian economy. And they genuinely believed that it would lead to a regime change in Russia. And of course, that we know failed catastrophically. And on the other hand, I think that they have had the sense that the American military is so endless and so enormous and has so much gear of all kinds that they never thought to themselves that that gear is limited. There's a limited supply of it. And they can't quite believe that this conflict has burned through so much gear so quickly. Because, I mean, do keep in mind, we're talking about, the last reputable figures I've heard about how many shells the Russians are sending over is something like 40,000 per day. Nobody in their right mind would have said that that would be something that would happen, say, a year and a half ago. But here we are. And that rate of attrition on both sides, of course, but the Russians actually having the industrial backing to maintain this tempo, whereas the West, the Americans, do not. I don't think that the Washington establishment really calculated those two issues. And those two enormous miscalculations based on false premises or premises that were not examined has led to this, I think it's shock on the part of the West. And that's why it seems to me that they're panicking now and they don't know where to go.
Absolutely. Can I just say, and it comes back directly to some of the points that have been made, and the question of ammunition shortages. It's been very much discussed in practical terms about what's been happening in Bakhmut. In, of all places, the Kiev Independent. Now they did a long
Yeah.
piece. They interviewed apparently about 12 Ukrainian soldiers, and they talk about the fact that they are severely outshelled, that they're very heavily out of guns. And the problem is, and I'm trying to find the right place, but probably I won't. But maybe you've all read it. But I mean, the point is, there's a Ukrainian soldier who's complaining that the Russians are able to fire shells at them continuously. And sometimes, you know exactly where the Russian guns are located, where the armored vehicles that are firing these things are located. But there is no Ukrainian counterfire because there are no shells. There are just not enough shells. And that's, if you want to understand what's happened in Bakhmut, clearly there's been a lot of tactics and a lot of infantry fighting as well. We mustn't underestimate that. But ultimately, it's the artillery. And one of those Ukrainian soldiers described how it works, what the Russians do. They send 3 or 4 people towards the Ukrainian front lines. The Ukrainians react, shoot at these people, give away their position, and then the Russian artillery opens fire on them. And that's apparently been the pattern of the battle right the way through. It's about ultimately ammunition and shells. And yes, there's surveillance devices, there's drones overhead, there's all of these things. And the effect is horrendous. I mean, the Russian defense minister has just said that Ukraine suffered 11,000 dead in February. We can't corroborate that figure, but it's not implausible based on some of the things Ukraine itself is saying. But it's like, I have to say, to me, it feels like a conveyor belt of death, actually. And this has been going on week after week, month after month. And ultimately, it's happened because of massive political miscalculations. I mean, really disastrous ones in the West, and massive logistical ones as well. And an inability to adapt policy to realities. I mean, am I saying anything that doesn't seem right here?
No, not at all. And I would also say that, now in the West, they're floating the idea of a ceasefire. You see it in a lot of different points that they're saying, oh, we should, have a ceasefire because the Russians are running out of ammunition. and of course, the ceasefire could have been gotten back in April of last year. And they were inches from the closing. And I mean, we retrospectively now realize. And so the fact that now they're floating it is, how can I put it? I've had quite a bit of experience in business. And, when you're negotiating with a counterparty, a lot of times, one counterparty thinks that they're stronger and they demand something and it doesn't happen. I mean, they have a deal on the table and the stronger or alleged or the counterparty that thinks that's stronger says, no, I'm not going to take that deal. It's not good enough. And then later circumstances or the realization dawns on them that they're not as strong as they thought. And they come crawling back to the negotiating table and say, hey, give me that deal that you were offering me before. I'll sign it. But of course, the other side realizes that they're the strong ones. And so they have no intention of signing that deal. So the notion that this conflict is going to end by some sort of ceasefire is laughable because the Russians have the West's number. The West is running out of ammunition. The Kiev regime is running out of troops, quite frankly, and catastrophically and horribly. And the West doesn't know where to go, whereas the Russians politically, in terms of their own population, have the will to go all the way. As everybody knows, the great criticism that's going on in Russia right now is that Putin is going too soft and he should just level the whole country and just take it over already, get it done already. And so the Kremlin has all the cards at this time in the conflict. Brian, I think you would agree.
Yeah. Something that both you and Alexander said. I mean, I want to point out that a sound mind wouldn't have pursued this proxy war in the first place. This was a decision made by the United States, by policy circles and interests there, who realize they're running out of time to reassert American primacy over the entire globe, not just with Russia, but also China. And they're rushing this whole process when I believe the window of opportunity has already long since closed. Now, I've noticed in the Kiev Independent as well, they were talking about the BBC and Media Zona count that they're keeping of Russian dead, and they're saying it's around 16,000, which is almost a tenth of what Kiev and Washington and London and everyone else has been saying it was. And when you put that together with the fact that the West has also said that around 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers have perished, probably more than that, actually, it's very obvious why that is. It's because Ukraine is completely outgunned by Russia. So we keep hearing from the West that Russia will run out of shells, or they are running out of shells. But and it's terrible that it has to come down to this. But the body count that even the West and Ukraine are admitting to says otherwise. It says they're not running out, and they're not going to run out. I see people talking about Prigozhin, and he's complaining about ammunition again, and talking about the possibility of Wagner getting encircled. It's not that that's impossible for that to happen. I guess we could talk about what's actually going on in and around Bakhmut. But that's something that will happen only if really, really bad mistakes are made on the Russian side. So overall, the ammunition, the military industrial output, these were things that everyone should have known before this started. Russia knew about it. We saw them preparing for this for years. And now the West has painted themselves into this corner. And just like Gonzalo was talking about, how do they get out of this? They want a ceasefire. We see even at this point, the West is still talking about, well, whenever the fighting stops, we're just going to rearm Ukraine more.
So why ceasefire? What incentive would you have for a ceasefire?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, exactly.
By the way, I just want to make a quick point about Wagner and Prigozhin and that whole thing. To me, this whole Prigozhin thing that he's blabbing and having fights with here and there and whomever, it kind of like reminds you of Patton Montgomery kind of conflict during the Second World War. When they kind of like know that they're winning, then all kinds of petty little jealousies and infighting starts cropping up. It means absolutely nothing. And him complaining about his Wagner people not having enough ammunition, I think it's just positioning, and anybody hanging their hat on that particular peg is just, and thinking that this will lead to the collapse of the Russians and so forth. They're just deluding themselves. This kind of jockeying for position among winning generals happens in every conflict, and I think it means nothing, quite frankly.
I mean, I think there's some truth to that. I mean, certainly what Prigozhin is doing is he's keeping himself very much center stage. I mean, he's there all the time. But we see him continuously now. I mean, whereas a few months ago he was the invisible man, now he's become the ubiquitous man. He gives us a running commentary constantly of what's going on in Ukraine, and of course he's also running, I think, some very unwise feuds with some very powerful people in Moscow. But that's his problem. I mean, I'm not going to go there and stress or worry about that. I mean, anything can happen in a war situation. There's large numbers of Ukrainian troops. He, by the way, has just said he thinks there's 20,000, around 12 to 20,000 Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut. Now, how he knows that, I don't know, but that's what he said. But there's large numbers of Ukrainian troops, not just in Bakhmut, but nearby. I think it's highly likely, this is my own guess, since they're not prepared to pull out, and they're not prepared to try to pull out, they're not prepared to negotiate a truce to get their men out, they're not prepared to tell them to surrender. It's logical to me, as a non-military person, that perhaps they will try some kind of an attack to try and relieve this force there, or to encircle the Wagner forces and all of those things. Now, that I'm not going to go ahead and say that's not going to succeed. But I have to say, if it does succeed, it's very much contrary to the trend of the fighting in Bakhmut up to now. And again, maybe I'm talking like a civilian now, but I can't imagine that war, different as it is so very different from what happens in civilian life. If if, for example, in a court case, somebody's losing, generally they go on losing. I mean, if you're talking about a particular battle, it doesn't reverse itself suddenly unless something extremely unexpected happens, which, of course, it may. But I'm not going to predict.
But to your point, Alexander, I think that what's going on is that they put so many of their chips on Bakhmut, to continue the gambling metaphor, that now that it's proving to be a bust as a bet, they don't know where to go. And they're thinking to themselves, well, we'll just send more troops or something. Something will turn up, something will turn around. Because psychologically, I mean, Zelensky was in front of the American Congress when he did that, blitzkrieg visit to Washington. And he said in front of the whole Congress, the joint session, he said that Bakhmut was, going to be held on to the last man, that was the decisive battle. And the decisive battle is apparently being lost. And so I think that on a political level, it is catastrophic. And I wonder whether an outright loss of Bakhmut, okay, I mean, not merely a retreat, but an outright loss, will not just severely crash the American political support for this conflict. I mean, not from the Biden administration, but from the other people in the political establishment in the United States. I think that this might be the kiss of death insofar as that support. What do you guys think?
Brian?
Well, I actually want to talk about what's going on with Bakhmut, because before we started the live stream,
sorry, I'm just going to get coffee.
we were talking about how people on the Ukrainian side talking about you've been talking about this for so long. It's taking so long for Russia to take Bakhmut. We see a lot of complaints about this, but this is the way Russia has decided to fight this conflict in the first place. They've decided to fight it in a very incremental way, and the focus has been on attrition, not on territory. As a matter of fact, we've seen them very willing to give up territory, no matter how politically damaging it would be, because militarily it made so much more sense in the long term. We could see that strategy is paying off. As a matter of fact, everything that we see now about Ukraine running out of weapons, running out of ammunition, the West running out of ammunition, they've emptied their arsenals into Ukraine. They have nothing left. It'll be years before they can produce more. That's all specifically because of the way Russia chose to fight this conflict. They are not doing these big arrow offensives because, just as Ukraine learned, when you do that, even if you have the manpower and the equipment to take territory, you are going to lose huge amounts of men and equipment. In a modern conflict where both sides are more or less even in terms of the type of weapons they have, the prepared defense lines, air defense systems to prevent air superiority. This is the outcome. So this is a very deliberate choice by Russia, and it has paid off. And they're not concerned about how long it's taking to take Bakhmut. All they're concerned about is that it serves as a black hole, pulling in Ukrainian troops and equipment. I was listening to both Alexander and Alex's videos about this over the last couple of days. There's there are rumors about Ukraine possibly the first Leopards they get, moving them into the area and possibly using them in a counter attack. And if this is true, and we should keep an eye out. We don't know if it's true or not, but if it is true, if they are taking their best trained men and their latest equipment and they're throwing it into this kind of confirms the thesis that Russia is putting pressure all along the line of contact to spoil preparations for the Ukrainian spring offensive. They're going to be spending men and equipment that were meant for that offensive. They're going to be spending it now instead of on the at a time of their own choosing. They will be spending it because Russia is forcing them to spend it. And I think people should think about that instead of being caught up on these very meaningless metrics of how much territory and how quickly it's being taken, because in this conflict, that doesn't matter.
Absolutely. Can I say one of the other effects of the fighting in Bakhmut is that for the first time, you're starting to see more and more articles in certainly the British media, but also the American media, about the enormity of Ukraine's losses. This has been a subject which at the start of the war wasn't emphasized. I mean, they talked about Russian losses. They didn't talk about Ukrainian losses. And this is beginning to feed through. There was one particularly distressing one, which I read in The Guardian, which is about as pro-Ukrainian a newspaper as you will find anywhere on the earth. And it says that does Europe want Ukrainians as living partners or as dead heroes? And it talks about where are most Ukrainian flags now. This is written, by the way, by a Ukrainian who is a very, very strong supporter of the Maidan revolution, who is a very, very strong opponent of Russia, talks about Putin in the most savage words. Where are most Ukrainian flags? Now they fly in the cemeteries of our cities and towns, where funerals take place non-stop. And then further down, since our military authorities keep silent about Ukrainian losses, avoiding these statistics of horror for strategic reasons, the cemetery with its newly planted woods of flags is where the body count becomes concrete, visible, and speaks the truth of death. And that's in The Guardian. And people in Britain are now reading that. So, which, as I said, is different from what they were reading before. That is what attrition does. It is killing people in thousands. And can I just come back to what you said, Brian, about, that the Russians are pushing all along the front lines? Can I ask you, does it also perhaps make sense to think that what the Russians are also doing is that they're laying siege to places, Bakhmut, Vuhledar, places in the north, Kupiansk, wherever, which they know that the Ukrainians have to defend if they're going to keep their line functional. And that, in effect, what the Russians are doing by pressing on these sort of places is they're forcing the Ukrainians to come to them. So where the artillery comes in. Is this something that makes logical sense to you?
That's exactly what I think they're doing. I think it's a spoiling effort ahead of the planned Ukrainian offensive. Ukraine blabbers about its offensives months in advance, telegraphs to the entire planet what they're going to do, and then Russia can just figure out how to confound it. We remember them preparing those tank traps, the dragon's teeth, the trenches, the bunkers, all of these defensive positions. Months and months ago, they were preparing this. They mobilized these 300,000. We see the Western media talk about the losses of Wagner. That's Wagner is a private military company that all of Ukraine's military is unable to stop around Bakhmut. And I don't hear the Western media talking about these 300,000 mobilized Russian reservists that are still waiting to go in. I did hear Michael Kaufman. He's a US-based, Ukrainian-born, one of these think tank analysts. And he made the point that these reservists haven't been committed yet. So that should tell people that this is not the main offensive. This is, just as you say, they're putting this pressure to force Ukrainian troops to come to them in areas where they have prepared, just as you say, artillery. They have this huge advantage of artillery. I think it was the Wall Street Journal. They said that Ukraine has something like 300 artillery pieces. Yeah. Just 300. They started out with over 1,000. Now they have 300. Russia has well over 1,000. So they are so completely outgunned. They're out of ammunition. They're out of guns. They're out of everything. And now they're going to where Russia dictates they go and fight.
How do you launch an offensive where the other side has this enormous advantage in artillery and shells? I mean, it doesn't seem to me to. I mean, I don't really understand that.
You can't, and you shouldn't, but they're doing it anyway out of political necessity. Russia does not say, well, we're going to do this big winter offensive. They never said that. They never announced that they started. So they always have all of this latitude to play with. Ukraine says, we're not giving this up. We're not giving anything up. We're going to do this offensive at this time. They paint themselves continuously into these corners that they then have to fight their way out over and over and over again. And it's because they and their Western sponsors are obsessed with optics. I kind of want to go back to the Guardian piece where this pro-Ukrainian author is frustrated with the huge losses Ukraine is suffering. And I just want to point out that since 2014, that was always the plan. The U.S. overthrew the Ukrainian government, and this was always meant to be a proxy war against Russia, fought entirely at the cost of the Ukrainian people. And that is what's playing out right now. And I just wish people like this woke up much sooner before it came to this.
I want to point out something that I think that a key issue is the political necessity of both sides. Because on the one hand, the Kiev regime requires the political backing of the West. So they have to make these big announcements and these big rah-rah, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. Whereas the Russian military has the full political support of the Kremlin. And the Kremlin basically says, do what you do best and do it as you see fit. And if you have to give up territory, we'll take the political hit. That's the big difference. Because the Ukraine side, the Kiev regime, could never give up a piece of territory, such as Kherson, for instance, because of the military necessity. Politically, it would be impossible. And that shows the weakness of the Kiev regime. It's all political. Whereas the Russians, they're looking at it, especially after the summer, when clearly negotiations were not going to happen anymore, and they would just have to grind through this war and get it done as a war. They're still calling it the SMO, the Special Military Operation, but it is a war. And the Russians are treating it as such. And they're throwing out the window any kind of political consideration. They're just grinding away to demilitarize, denazify, and free the Donbass. And they're succeeding. And so I think that is the key issue, the political dimension, which the Russians have firmly in hand. And they're letting Gerasimov and Surovikin do as they see fit, and no questions asked.
I'm going to add something else to that, which is that, of course, you're quite right, Ukraine, there are political pressures within Ukraine itself that do what Brian said, launch these unwise offensives. But, of course, the major pressure for these offensives comes from the West. It's the West that's constantly telling Ukraine, you must go on the attack.
The political pressure from the West. Yeah.
I mean, I found it quite astonishing, actually, just a few weeks ago, around, just before the new year, I think it was, that somebody, I can't remember who it was, who came along from the US and said to Ukraine, look, you've got until the summer. You've got to win this war by launching a successful offensive before the summer. So just do it. We're going to provide you with a couple of tanks, a couple of hundred tanks. We're going to provide you with a couple of hundred infantry fighting vehicles. You've never used these kinds of machines before in combat, but we'll give you what training we can. And you've got to use all these weapons and go on to the attack now. I mean, not now, but, in a couple of weeks, a couple of months. And so, in effect, it's Washington that is dictating Ukraine's timetable. And that seems to me amazing. I mean, again, one of the best things I've learned, Brian, is how long it takes to use these weapons properly from your programs. I mean, even Leopard 2s, and I've checked this out, by the way, I had a very interesting meeting a short while ago with somebody who worked in the British military. And he absolutely said to me exactly the same things that you've been saying, that you can't just jump into a tank and, however skilled and intelligent and resourceful you are, and use it. You might learn the basics. You might know how it drives and how its gun fires, but that's not enough in order to use it in battle. But that is what Ukrainians are being pushed to do.
Exactly. I don't think people appreciate that modern warfare is not about a single soldier or a single fire team or a single tank crew. It's not even just a group of tanks or a group of soldiers on the battlefield. The soldiers, the tanks, the air power that Ukraine doesn't even have, the artillery, absolutely everything has to work in concert. And whichever side is able to put more variety of units on the battlefield and coordinate them better, that is who is eventually going to win. And Ukraine does not have the ability to do this because, just as you say, there's not enough time to train them. You see these losses that Ukraine is suffering, the trained manpower that they had going into the special military operation. That has been chipped away. And especially when you lose NCOs and officers, you can't get that back. That takes years. It takes years to develop good NCOs and good officers. That is just simply time Ukraine doesn't have. And just to point out, the U.S. tried to do the exact same thing in Syria. They were waging this proxy war against the Syrian government and its military, and they were trying to conjure up a military out of thin air, and it simply did not work for all of these reasons. It did not work, and because the Syrian Arab army and their allies were organized, they maintained cohesion throughout the conflict. This is why they prevailed, and I think we're seeing the exact same thing play out in Ukraine right now.
What a shit show. I'm sorry for being so vulgar, but there's no other expression to like summarize the situation. What a complete shit show. And the Ukrainian nation is destroyed. Okay, quite frankly.
Yes.
The 15 million civilians who have left, and most of them women, so it's going to be a demographic catastrophe, even if the war were to end right this second. The Ukrainian nation is going to be left with half of its population, a majority elderly or severely wounded veterans of this conflict, with no women. And so the possibility of family formation here in Ukraine is going to be nil. As a country, even if this conflict were to end instantly somehow, and they come to some agreement that, okay, the Donbass and the land bridge to Crimea is Russia forever, and what remains of Ukraine can restart somehow. It's just not going to happen. Half the population is gone. The family forming people are gone. This is a catastrophe for the Ukrainian nation. And the tragedy is that it didn't need to happen. It happened because Washington wanted it to happen for their own piddly little geopolitical games that blew up in their face. Because now, of course, Europe's economy is toast. And what do they have to show for it? They don't have anything to show for it. I mean, if you look at the balance sheet of results of this conflict, insofar as the West is concerned, they achieved nothing except the destruction of Ukraine. And the Russians, quite the contrary, they've opened up markets in China, in India, in Pakistan. They've strengthened, ties with China, with India. The trade with China and India has increased dramatically. With Iran and Russia are much closer than they were before this conflict. It's all blown up in their face, and this is the tragedy of it. It's been a complete disaster, and how the West is going to extract itself from this mess, how the Washington establishment is going to extract itself from this mess. I think that personally, and I want to throw this to you, Alexander, I think that they're just going to basically turn away suddenly and ignore it, like the whole Ukraine thing never happened. Do you think that is what they're going to go for?
I think they might try, but I think it's going to be incredibly difficult. I mean, one of the fundamental problems is that the public mobilization in many Western countries around Ukraine has been so intense. I mean, to give you an example of what I mean, and I'm talking now about Britain, 40% of British people have donated money to the Ukrainian cause. Wow. Now, they haven't necessarily done that. Wait, let me explain, because they haven't necessarily done this wanting to. What has happened is, you go into your local grocery, your supermarket, you buy you put your goods through the paying machines, and they said, will you pay £1 addition for some good cause? And the good cause is, of course, Ukraine, and people do feel under pressure to do that. Now, that was going on an awful lot last year. It's eased off recently. I haven't seen it so much recently, but there's been an awful lot of that. And of course, Ukraine has been in the media all the time. We've been hearing stories. People put out their flags, their Ukrainian flags. You don't see that so much anymore, but you still see a few. So just switching off after people have been mobilized to that extent, and after, of course, we have the economic problems, which are growing. I mean, if I can say, I'm the one person amongst the four of us who lives in a West European country. You could see the problems. I mean, the food price inflation, which takes many forms. For example, jars of pickles, for example, have suddenly They remain the same price, and they've suddenly shrunk in size. And
Shrinkflation.
quite dramatic. Quite exactly. There's a lot of that going on. And talk is that industry is flat, that housing is imploding. Apparently in Germany, they're in a manufacturing recession. Companies are leaving. And everywhere, right across Europe, living standards are falling. And of course, people have been told this, we've got to do this because it's important to support Ukraine. And a lot of people have believed this. I mean, they hear what's been said. They hear all the things that have been said about Russia, about Putin, about the way in which this was an unprovoked war of aggression. And they've gone along with it. So you can't just walk away. There will be consequences. There will be bigger consequences, in my opinion, certainly in Europe, than there were in the United States after the end of the war in Vietnam, for example. I mean, it will have a major impact, if it all fails, on the credibility of the political system and of the political class, which is already held in a lot of contempt by a great many people.
So, Alexander, let me follow that up, that issue up with you. So, if they can walk away, will they double down yet again by encouraging the Poles to become the next proxy? Because that Biden meeting with Zelensky, everybody paid attention to the meeting with Zelensky, but I'm really curious about Biden's meeting with Duda and potentially Kaczynski in Poland. Do you think that the Americans are sort of like, giving a wink and a nudge to the Poles and say, hey, why don't you go up to bat and take your slice of Galicia?
I'm going to go out on a limb here because the first thing to say is I don't know, and I think we need to be clear about this. And we're now to a great extent guessing, but I think that the time when this was being seriously thought about and considered, both in Warsaw and in Washington, might have passed. And I think the reason is that the Polish military is itself extremely unenthusiastic, to put it mildly, about this idea. And I think they pretty much said as much. Bear in mind, the Polish military has been weakened. It's had to give, 14 of its Leopard 2 tanks to the Ukrainians. It's given many of its Crab howitzers to the Ukrainians. An awful lot of that, equipment has already gone. And thousands of people have apparently been leaving the Polish military because they don't want to be sent to fight the Russians in Ukraine. So there's been a retention problem, which has been apparently a major one, much talked about in Poland. And I've been listening to, Polish senior military people, and they're not keen on this idea. And I'm going to say something else. If you're looking further west, you're talking about Germany. The idea of Germany getting stuck and paying the bills for a Polish adventure in Ukraine, well, I cannot imagine anything that's going to harden German opposition to the war more than something like that. And opposition to the war in Germany is now growing anyway. So, I can't discount this. I think it's possible. But, if things deteriorate and, reach a sort of great crisis, then, there might be, a resurrection of this idea. But for the moment, I don't think that the Poles are keen on it. And I think Washington has understood that.
I was just gonna say that they're running. They don't really have any good options, but the options that they've been exploring right now, they're not panning out. So all that's going to be left are even worse options, which includes trying to get Poland involved as a proxy, making some kind of move regarding Moldova and Transnistria, and who knows what else, getting more involved in Belarus. We saw that attempted attack, whatever that was, that they tried to do in Belarus. We see Ukraine doing incursions into Russia, and these are worse ideas, and it all blows up in their face, even worse than what they've been doing. And that is the the risk here. These are people that got themselves in way in over their head, and they're not capable of winning the war, but they're also psychologically incapable of losing it. They refuse to recognize that reality, so they keep going further and further into delusion, and that is dangerous.
You know, the Bryansk thing for me,
I'm sorry. Before I just, can I just say, Brian Gonzalo, that on that incursion into Russia, it has been a spectacular PR disaster for Ukraine. And the reason this has been so is that the British media, they got very excited about the fact that there were some Russian soldiers, and they interviewed one of them. And of course, it immediately turned out that he was a person with this extreme right-wing ideology, which we don't want to name here. But I mean,
from the mid-20th century, I'm guessing.
Mid-20th century, exactly. Anyway, it all came tumbling out. It was in the Financial Times. It was in the Telegraph. It was in all sorts of things, apparently on the broadcast interviews. And he made things even worse by saying, "Oh yeah, of course, I had absolutely Ukraine's help and permission to do it. Couldn't have done it without them." So I mean, it was in presentational terms, in PR terms, that episode was an absolute train wreck in the West. Of course, in Russia, it's only just going to harden opinion there.
Oh yeah,
they have to see it through. Anyway, Gonzalo interrupted you.
No. To add to your point, you know, and I was laughing before. I'm certainly not laughing at any of the people who were injured or killed in the Bryansk situation. But Bryansk was just, you know, the epitome of stupid. Because number one, it's a civilian city with nothing military of any military significance, certainly not insofar as this conflict is concerned. They basically just shot up a bunch of civilians, which is basically a war crime. I mean, this is murder. I mean, that's what we're talking about. Insofar as Russian public opinion, you know, especially considering some of the terrorist attacks that Russia has suffered from various sources over the years. Remember that the one with the children. I don't even want to think about it. But, you know, this only hardens Russian opinion. Why? Who on God's earth would have said, "Oh, this sounds like a really good idea. Let's send a bunch of we know who to the middle of Russia to shoot up civilians for no reason whatsoever and no military significance whatsoever." It's a disaster. And the guy just spilling the beans because, you know, there's that thing about white supremacists. You know, the wokesters in the West say that white supremacy is everywhere. If you actually meet a white supremacist, he will proudly tell you that he is such. If you meet a neo whatever, he will proudly tell you as such. And that's what this guy did. Just happily just spilled the beans. I mean, what other effect do you think that this was going to have? It's just remarkable political stupidity. But it points to me as absolute desperation on the part of the Kiev regime because they simply do not know where to go because they know that it's over. I mean, it really is over.
Yeah. Well, whoever came up with that particular idea, I mean, I hope he hasn't. He's in place any longer because, as I said, in PR terms, it was a despicable thing to do anyway. But it was an absolute disaster. I mean, it was a massive own goal.
Yeah, and to further this point of desperation, you know, we're seeing videos. I've seen videos of what seems to be from videos taken from the Russian side of what seems to be chemical attacks on the front lines. And that seems to be the case because a month or so ago, I do believe, we saw this video emerging of these drones with all these canisters of apparently chemical weapons and a fridge full of these canisters of chemical weapons. Then nobody really knows what they were, but chlorine gas or whatever other gas that they would use. Yeah. And now we're seeing actual footage of soldiers. And it's very clear that it's not fake. I mean, the reaction of the soldiers and the cameraman were like, what the hell is happening to you? You know, it's not like they knew what was happening. And so I think that this just points to the desperation of the Kiev regime. And I do believe, to go back to Bakhmut, that number one, I would not be surprised if they put together some sort of force to do a breakthrough, thinking that this is Baston and this is World War II, that they're going to try to reinforce Bakhmut, and those poor men are going to suffer the same fate as previous men, or that they're going to throw one last roll of the dice in some big offensive, which will be ill-prepared and will be catastrophic. I do believe that we are coming to the end goal of this whole conflict. Yeah. And in attritional warfare, it's not the land, it's treating the opposing army I do believe that they're
Yeah.
coming up to the end, and I think that's why all this panic is going on, and this hand-wringing and inability to come up with any kind of sensible idea that will salvage the situation. Brian, would you agree?
Indeed.
Yes, no, I agree with that.
No.
What I would say is, looking at the proxy war in Syria, a lot of the same things happened. The U.S. backed proxies did resort to chemical weapons. They resorted to chemical weapons as a means of fighting, and also as a means of waging a propaganda war to try to justify a U.S. or wider NATO intervention in Syria, and it didn't work. And they carried out all kinds of terrorist attacks all over the place. We remember in Turkey, I believe it was a Russian ambassador or a Russian diplomat who was shot dead at an art show or something like that. They did all of these extremely provocative but desperate things, and Syria, their allies, Russia, Iran, they ignored it. They ignored all of these provocations. They stayed laser focused on the objective, and then they prevailed. And I think we are seeing the same thing happening in Ukraine. Bakhmut, this offensive, people do have to be aware that the possibility of a counteroffensive exists. We don't know the exact disposition of Ukrainian and Russian forces in that area or on the battlefield in general. We have a basic idea, but we don't know specifically. And so there could be. And if we remember, again, back to Syria, the battle for Aleppo, there actually was a breakthrough toward the end of that battle. And there were points where large numbers of Syrian forces could have been encircled, but it didn't happen. When you're in the process of being encircled, you're being encircled in the first place because you're weaker than your opponents. That's why that's happening. So even the breakthrough, while it seemed hopeful at the time, it really was futile. And I think, again, it's going to be the same regarding Bakhmut.
I remember that well. I remember that breakthrough very well, and the triumphant newspaper articles that appeared in parts of the British media at the time. And well, within a few weeks, of course, it had all run its course. Can I shift gears a bit, and let's always talk a bit about the geopolitics, because I've come to the view that the reason that Scholz went to Washington and met Biden was obviously partly about Ukraine, but it was also about China, because the other thing that's happened over the last few weeks, in my opinion, is that, if I can put it like this, the shadow of China has now started to fall. Now, I don't know whether either of you know, but there's been a very, very strong statement from the Chinese government today, basically saying that if the United States continues in the current course that it's taking, then guardrails to protect the Chinese-US relationship will just fall away and the whole thing will tip over. I mean, it's a very, very unusually strong statement. Comes after a whole cascade of position papers, including a very tough one, very true one, by the way, on US foreign policy, US hegemony as it operates today. So China, which has not been looking for a fight, and I think this is absolutely clear to me. I mean, the Chinese, however, are coming round now to the view that the US is looking for a fight with them. And I think this is partly now forming, it's now shaping Chinese policy. It's going to start shaping Chinese policy on the topic of Ukraine. And I also come around to the view, by the way, that the Chinese probably 2-3 weeks ago weren't thinking of sending arms to Russia. I've been now looking through all the various Chinese statements, and they've never said that they would not do it, but they've never said they were going to do it. It just wasn't even a topic for discussion. Then the United States throws it in. It now admits it's got no evidence that the Chinese are in fact planning to send weapons to China. I think it's part of the sort of anti-China campaign the US is running. But I mean, from a Chinese point of view, you can almost see, if you're going to be criticized and sanctioned for doing something which you are not in fact doing, well, why not
Do
in
it.
that case just go ahead and do it? I mean, this seems to me the kind of logic.
I've been thinking a great deal about the China situation. I did an entire video on the U.S. hegemony and its perils paper that the Chinese Foreign Ministry released. I released it a couple of days after that paper came out because I read it and I realized what it was. It is the resignation of the Chinese leadership that they are going to go to war with the United States, rather. And I do not believe that you can read that position paper as anything else other than a laundry list of political sins that the United States has committed. And the fact, it seems to me to be a subtle way of declaring war, of saying, look, these are the reasons that we're eventually going to have a conflict with the United States. These actions that the United States has done. And Alex, I'd ask you if you wouldn't mind to share the link to that position paper, which I think is extraordinarily significant. Just as Brian, he's always talking about the Rand Corporation paper of how to dismember Russia. Well, for me, this paper, U.S. Hegemony and Its Perils, I think is a crucial document because I think it lays out the prosecution's case against the United States. And I think it signals that the Chinese Communist Party, as a party, has made up its mind, yeah, we're going to have to go to war with the United States. We don't want to, but they are clearly coming for us, so we're going to get prepared for it. And my thinking at this time is that, and also, by the way, in the United States, there's a lot more anti-China sentiment. So that's coming out in the mainstream news organizations, which are basically propaganda outlets for the Biden regime. So I think that we're going to see, continued talk about how evil China is and the beginnings of the famous sanctions escalator that Alexander coined that particular phrase. And I think it's going to get a lot worse in 2024 insofar as sanctions. And they're going to have the same effect that the sanctions against Russia had on Europe. But the sanctions against China are going to blow the American economy out of the water. And I think that as the economic situation deteriorates in 2024, because of the sanctions against China, then there will be this panic response of egging on a war, especially as the Biden regime and the Democratic Party generally feels that their position politically in the United States is slipping. There will be more of a banging the drum for war with China, which I personally expect in 2025. And I think that it is going to happen. And I think that these position papers that the Chinese Foreign Ministry has released just underlines the fact that they themselves have realized, yeah, we're going in that direction and there's nothing to stop it. Because in the United States, there is not the political leadership that would halt this insane escalation of aggressiveness towards the major powers. They've done this with Russia and it's failed. And so they're going to double down and go after China. And it's going to be even worse. I mean, that's my position at this time. I don't know if you gentlemen would agree with this.
Ron?
Yes, I do. I agree with both of you. The United States has made it abundantly clear they're going to war with China. They are going to contain China. There's, the way things are going right now, unless the U.S. does commit to some sort of armed conflict with China and somehow win, inevitably China is going to surpass the United States. This policy of containing China is not working, will not work. So the only way in their minds that they can make it work is by precipitating some sort of conflict. They have U.S. troops in Taiwan, despite officially recognizing Taiwan as part of China, the one China policy. And at the same time, they have troops there. They're talking about expanding the number of troops there. They say that this is for training Taiwanese forces on the island. But in reality, they've written policy papers about this. This is called the tripwire force. This is in the realization that if China does decide to resolve the Taiwan question by force, they will succeed unless the United States not only intervenes directly, but also immediately. So they want this tripwire force there so that they have the ability to immediately react militarily. But even then, these policy think tanks that are drumming these ideas up in the first place are skeptical that it will turn out in what you would consider an actual victory, because they're talking about all kinds of U.S. ships, and including multiple carriers sunk, thousands, if not tens of thousands of soldiers, sailors, and airmen dead. on the U.S. side. So how do you figure that as a victory? And of course, Taiwan is scoured of all industry, infrastructure, and human life, and yet they think that somehow they're going to pull a victory off here. But it's exactly like with Ukraine. It is a proxy war. They're waging it at Taiwan's expense. It has nothing to do with protecting Taiwan.
I think the immediate thing that they're going to push for, and I think this is what all that discussion about Chinese weapons supplies to Russia was about. I think it was basically a way of winning over the Europeans to the idea of sanctions against China. Because I think if you follow Europeans, you follow the way the Europeans have been discussing the situation, it's clear to me that most of them, they're not actually terribly interested in a conflict with China. China is far away. It's not a challenger to the United States. To Europe. Europe is not a superpower, a hegemonic power, the way that the United States is. Europe isn't in any kind of rivalry with China. And of course, we are economically dependent upon the Chinese anyway. So why would the Europeans join in a sanctions war with China? They wouldn't, except, of course, that the European leaders are now very invested in this war in Ukraine. So you tell them, look, you've got to agree to sanctions against China because the Chinese are working towards supplying arms to the Russians. You put the whole topic of sanctions that way against China on the table in a way that European leaders can't really push back too hard on, because they're so committed to Ukraine that they just can't walk away, given this specter of Chinese weapons to Russia having now been introduced. Does that all make sense to you? Do you understand the point I'm trying to make? That this is why I think this whole story about Chinese weapons supplies to Russia was floated in the first place.
Yeah. By the way, Alexander, you have a lot of contacts in Germany, and I wanted to ask you because I saw recently an interview with a leader. I don't know her name, but she was a leader in Die Linke, and she was talking about Nord Stream, and she wanted investigations into Nord Stream.
Yes,
it seems that the Nord Stream story is starting to percolate in Germany. Is that the case?
Right. Well, first of all, the thing to say is it's never been completely suppressed, as it has been in Britain and has largely been in the United States. In Germany, people do talk about it, and they talk about it an awful lot more than they do in Britain and the US, because obviously, Germany was directly affected. So it's always been there. Now, I think the interview that you're referring to is with a leader of Die Linke, not Sarah Wagenknecht, who's the person everybody knows about, but another one. And I don't pretend I know all the politicians in Germany, not by any stretch. But I think the point she was making is investigators, the people who are trying to carry out these investigations about what's happened to Nord Stream, are not reporting on what they're finding to the Bundestag, to the German parliament. People aren't being kept out of information. The information is not circulating within the political circles in Germany as it should be over a matter of this importance. And she said, this is completely unacceptable. And I know more and more people in Germany are thinking this. And of course, if we come back to Germany, I mean, Germany is going through a very difficult economic time. I mean, the cutting off, the loss of cheap gas from Russia has been a blow. The loss of the Russian market, not a huge market for Germany, but still a significant one, and one which was very built in to German companies' plans for the future. Well, that's also been a blow. But of course, if you are seriously going to talk about sanctions against China, which is Germany's biggest export market. I mean, for the Germans, I mean, that is a catastrophe. So I think that what reason Scholz went to Washington is all this talk from Washington about, sanctions against China. He's under pressure from the German business community. He's rushed off to Washington and he's had a chat with Biden, and he basically says, for heaven's sake, let's not go down this road. Germany is not really ready for it. You can see this from the readout, because the readout, it says, it talks about Ukraine at the beginning, and then at the very end, other topics of global importance.
Tasmania, that's what they were talking about.
Discussed. I mean, that sort of thing. So I think that this talk about the Chinese weapons supplies, I think it might have consolidated some people in Europe behind the US, but I think it's also spooked some others. And I think it might have spooked Scholz. And I think that might be the reason that he went to Washington. I mean, it's very interesting to read also Biden's introductory words to Scholz, which are the only parts of the conversation that we know, which were clearly pre-prepared. And Scholz is talked about as this loyal and steadfast leader who's courageously taken all these decisions. Well, that's a very double-edged compliment if you think about it, because what makes Scholz loyal and steadfast from an American point of view is that he's agreed to a sanctions war against Russia, which you could argue was contrary to German interest. So that's what Biden is saying. If you're going to remain steadfast, then you've got to continue on this path, irrespective of whatever private doubts you might have.
Yeah, and the fact that Scholz has not said a peep about Nord Stream, basically now, but de facto, Olaf Scholz owns the Nord Stream terrorist attack. So so politically, he's on the boat with the Americans, and he can't get off this boat. Further, I would point the obvious. German and broadly Western European prosperity has been held up by a tripod of three factors. Number one, the American military umbrella that allows them to devote far less of their GDP to the military than they ordinarily would have had to. Number two, the Russian energy, cheap Russian energy. And number three, cheap Chinese consumer goods and higher end electronics. And if they knock out, they've knocked out the second leg. If they knock out the third, where is Europe going to be? They'll be priced out of any markets, and their industry will just collapse. I think that this is really the American drive to maintain its hegemony is just going to crush the Europeans. I think that's the ultimate result of all this.
Well, just to get a sense of how delusional this whole thing has become, let me try your patience, gentlemen, by reading to you an extract from an article in the Financial Times, supposedly a business newspaper, by Gideon Rachman. Now, Gideon Rachman is a person who's fully signed on to the Anglo-American foreign policy line, if I could put it like that. And he now talks about China, and he talks about sanctions against China. This is in the Financial Times, and it says the Chinese know that Western corporations and consumers are too dependent on them to attempt a complete economic decoupling. But if trade with the West dropped by even 30%, the results would be felt in higher unemployment in China, which would worry a government that is acutely sensitive to displays of popular unrest. I mean,
it's delusional.
Reducing trade with China by 30% at a time when we are already struggling with an inflation crisis, not just in Europe, but across the collective West, with inflation rising, where Jerome Powell has just today said that he might have to start raising interest rates even more aggressively than he had done. I mean, you're going to reduce trade with China by 30%. First of all, I mean,
it's just a little 30%. Alexander, I insist. Yeah. You're talking about a big 30%, but they're talking about a little 30% that you'll hardly feel it. It'll be a mosquito bite. They're insane. I mean, this is crazy. And the funny thing is that they say that this will affect the Chinese leadership insofar as popular discontent in China. The Chinese people, they're not stupid. they're going to realize that this drop, insofar as their trade is concerned, is not because of the Chinese leadership. It's because of the sanctions. Sanctions have never worked because the people there realize that it's not their government's fault. It's because of the United States imposing these sanctions over whatever excuse that they have of the day. And that is what's going to hurt them. So they're not going to blame the Chinese Communist Party. They're going to blame the West, rightfully so. This is just delusional. I'm sorry.
I just want to point out that the U.S. is going to force Europe to do this. It is going to completely destroy whatever's left of Germany's economy, socioeconomic stability. And this is a lot like someone with cancer doing chemotherapy. They're poisoning their body, hoping that the cancer dies before their whole body dies. That is the concept here that the U.S. is resorting to in this. And just as Gonzalo said, this is all just about clinging to American primacy over the entire globe, which is
it's ego-driven.
The very premise is rooted in fantasy. It makes no sense, and everything they build up on top of it departs further and further away from reality. And it is extremely dangerous. China can see that the U.S. is not going to be rational, reasonable, and they're preparing for this, just like Russia did years and years before this current conflict began. They're putting all the pieces into place, and the Chinese population, they're acutely aware of what the U.S. and Europe had done to them during what they call the century of humiliation. That is still something in their collective conscious. And so when the U.S. starts making moves to try to deliberately hurt China, the population is going to understand exactly what this is. This is and what is at stake if they cannot prevail over what the U.S. attempts to try to do. So I think, again, the U.S. is rushing. The window of opportunity probably has already closed. They don't think that it has. They keep talking about 2025. China starting a war over Taiwan by 2025. No, it is the U.S. desperate for a war with China before 2025, because after that, China is going to eclipse the United States. And then at that point, there is nothing the U.S. can do militarily or economically to coerce China any further. This idea that they're going to contain China, I just don't see it happening. It's,
Brian,
but they will destroy everything trying.
Yeah, Brian, can I ask you the following question? You know, I've always thought to myself that the Trump victory in 2016 essentially postponed by 4 years this entire plan. And, you know, the funny thing is that this plan, if they had carried it out starting in 2016, you know, we'd be like in basically 2018 having this proxy conflict with Russia. And Russia would have been less prepared economically, financially, and perhaps militarily even to withstand it. Do you agree with me that maybe it's the fact that Trump won that threw the kibosh into this whole plan that these people have obviously been working on for years, if not decades, quite frankly? Do you see my point?
Actually, despite Trump, his rhetoric being opposed to all of this, he populated his cabinet with exactly the people who sought to carry this out. And when they were in these positions, they did move it forward during his administration. It just wasn't something he was involved in. At times he was opposed to it. But just as everyone says, it is the deep state. It has a life of its own. And I would say the president, any president, not just Trump, they really have no say in the matter. If they will say, do this, do that, but these people actually then have to do it. And if they don't, and the media is backing the deep state over whoever was elected president, then that's what's going to happen, because this is about money and power. It's not about some title, the result of election. That is relatively meaningless. Yeah.
No, but do you think that at least Trump tripped them up a little bit in their plans and forced them to postpone it a bit? Or do you think that they were planning on, 2022, 2023, having this conflict with Russia and then moving on to China on this timetable? It's really academic, and I'm just kind of curious about it.
I think the reason why is because the U.S. is not nearly as powerful as they think. Things are going slowly because they're not as powerful as they wish they were. These things are not working out the way they want, just like their proxy war in Ukraine, because look at Russia, look at how they depict Russia, and look at what Russia is in reality. And the same goes for China, actually, many times over. The misconceptions that I hear from these think tank analysts, when they're on their YouTube channel that they know regular people aren't watching, and they're still talking entirely delusional. They're disconnected from reality, the reality in China. Have they ever gone there and seen it in person? Do they interact with the nations along its periphery that trade and do business with China? Apparently not, because their vision of the world is opposite of reality, and it shows, because they pick these policies that are impossible to implement successfully. I think that is what's holding them back more than anything else.
I think, Gonzalo, just to go on your point, I think they got delayed in Syria. I think that really hurt them. They wanted the regime change in Syria and they couldn't get it. I think Trump did delay them, but you could also make the argument that Russia may not have been ready. Like if Hillary won, maybe Russia may not have been ready for the economic shock and all. But then you can make the argument that Germany and the EU, they would also not be ready for those types of cutoffs with Russia. So who knows? But I think Syria played a big part in knocking the neocons off course. They couldn't overthrow Assad. I think Belarus played a big part. And a lot of people don't talk about that. And the reason I bring that up is because just yesterday, Lukashenko, the courts in Belarus, they sentenced Tikhanovskaya, the opposition leader who's in exile in Poland. They sentenced her to 15 years in prison for trying to overthrow the government. But I think the plan, once they got all their pieces in place, they got Biden there, and they felt like they could go ahead with their plan to take out the Putin regime, to overthrow them. I think their plan was Belarus. Let's get Belarus first and let's knock it out. We have the elections. We feel that Lukashenko is weak. He's vulnerable. Let's take him out. Once we get Belarus, maybe then we swing to Kazakhstan. I don't know if Kazakhstan was inaudible. I don't know if when they lost Belarus, they said, okay, maybe we can do something in Kazakhstan, or if they panicked, I don't know. But I think the Belarus, the fact that they couldn't get a coup in Belarus, that they failed, I think that was big, because it would be a much different conflict if the EU had Belarus and Russia was pretty much just all alone over there. I don't know. That's just my take on it.
I think you're right.
I bring that up because
I think you're very right. Syria tripped them up, but I think that you're right. The biggest stumbling block was probably Belarus. And I agree with you. The Kazakhstan thing was an audible, like a last-minute improvised thing, because of the fact that the Russians with the Kazakhstan government were able to smother it so quickly in January of 22, kind of like proves that point. They weren't really prepared for Kazakhstan. And I remember the Belarus thing, because I knew some Belarusians when I was living in Amsterdam at the time. And they were all talking about it. It was all they were saying. And they were all convinced that Lukashenko would be overthrown in that color revolution. And the fact that he held on, I think, really threw a spanner in the works. I think you're right.
I agree also, Alex. Syria and Belarus, then also Kazakhstan, then here in Southeast Asia, the military in Myanmar ousted the client regime the U.S. set up there. And there's many setbacks that 10, 20 years ago would never have happened. And this is because many people are mobilizing against this. And just think of how Russia squashed that in Kazakhstan. That's something that we didn't normally see, say 10, 20 years ago. But China, Russia are openly talking about the concept of color revolution and openly and specifically fighting back against it with their partners. I think that is a huge advance from what we had been seeing. And I think that is tripping up the U.S. and these plans of theirs, rearranging the game board in their favor.
Yeah, and now they're doing it in Hungary, of all places. You saw Samantha Powers, tweeting out video of her with USAID, and they're bringing, openness and transparency and democracy to Hungary, as if it's like, like I don't know, North Korea or something. And these guys don't know when to quit. I mean, what the hell is the matter with these people?
Well, there's heavy pressure, as Alex brought up in a video we did. There's been heavy pressure now on both Hungary and Serbia, the two dissident European nations that are left. Alex, I mean, we've had a discussion. Does anybody else want to, Brian, Gonzalo, do you want to add anything further? Otherwise, perhaps we could go over to Alex and ask Alex makes more contributions, maybe, or perhaps
Well,
we can look at some questions. I mean, what do
well,
people
it's
think?
about everyone's time. Do you guys have time
Time.
for a few
Sure.
questions?
I'm free, completely free.
Okay. Gonzalo, how are you on time? 30
I'm
minutes?
fine so long as no missile hits me.
Okay.
If
Okay, let's
one
do- let's
does,
do-
well, that's my only
Is
concern.
30 minutes okay to go through
Let's
these
do
questions?
30 minutes.
Follow-up,
Yeah, it's
sure.
about 30
Okay.
minutes. Yeah. No.
Okay, great. Let me just give me 1 second to pull
Well,
up.
thank you, it says. You're welcome.
Yeah, that's the first question. Let's see, from Otno Sens, Gonzalo, a guesstimate for Kharkov falling under Russian control. My bet is before the end of June. Will Z-Men have the decency to declare it an open city?
I don't know, quite frankly. Do keep in mind, Kharkov is a very spread out city. Okay, so in terms of militarily capturing it, it would be a nightmare. Okay, it's huge. It's the second largest city of Ukraine, and it's spread out. Okay, so how that would play out, I personally don't think that there's going to be any combat in Kharkov. Kharkov is an ethnically Russian city. There are a lot of people back in Kharkov, and they are Russian. So I don't think that the Kiev regime would make a stand here. I think, frankly, the city of Kharkov is so close to the Russian border on the one hand, so intimately tied to Russia in terms of the people who are here now. I don't see open warfare, city warfare, urban warfare happening here at all. I think if my thinking at this point, and I'd ask you, gentlemen, if you agree, is that the conflict is going to remain around Donbass until some sort of tipping point, breaking point of morale and just simply a lack of manpower. And then the Kiev regime forces are simply going to collapse at some point. I think that is in the offing. And I do believe that this panicking reaction, this random thrashing around by the Kiev regime, Bryansk and chemical weapons and what we've been talking about, I think it's desperation because they know that the clock is ticking and they're coming to the end. And so if there is a sudden collapse, the Russians would sweep in, because everybody seems to forget that the Russians have surrounded Ukraine on the Belarusian border, on the eastern border of Ukraine, and in the south, with altogether something like 600, 700,000 troops. My personal take has always been that that's an occupying force. And they're going to roll that force in once the Kiev regime has just given up the ghost and perhaps fled to the west. That's my thinking. And furthermore, and to finish the point, I don't know when this war will end. I'd be incredibly surprised if by the end of December we're still having conversations like this. I think that it will be over by the end of the year. When precisely? It's like the famous tipping point. You never know when it happens. Retrospectively, you might be able to say, oh yeah, that's of course when it was going to happen. But before the moment happens, you can't really predict it. That's my thinking at this time.
All right. Brian, I'm on your Patreon as well as here on the Duran. Prigozhin is worried he won't receive regular Russian army support and will be pushed back from Artemovsk. Are you worried?
He has been continuously saying things like this, and yet Bakhmut continues to be encircled. So I don't know. I don't know what the story is. I talk to many people who are relatively well informed about what's going on in Russia, and they say that this is publicity. This is about publicity rather than reality. I think Alexander, you have made similar comments about this. Yeah. The drama over the ammunition. He got a lot of attention doing that. It seems like he's just doing that again. Right in a row.
Absolutely. I just want to add one further point about Prigozhin, which is, I think, not one that many people don't understand, which is that he is a complete civilian. He has never served in the armed forces. He's never trained as an officer. He has no command experience. He is not the operational commander of the Wagner fighters. Now, I'm no doubt he's very connected with them, and he knows pretty much everything that's going on. But I'm sure that the military chain of command goes through him, but also around him as well. And I'm sure that lots of debates go on and all kinds of things happen. And it's notable that the actual commanders in the Wagner group, they're remaining absolutely quiet about this. This is Prigozhin himself I suspect, I'm going to be blunt about this, I think he's intent on carving out a political role when the war is over. He sees himself as the hero of Bakhmut, the man who took Bakhmut. He's looking already for that role where he could say, well, it's all me and I did it despite all these cowards and traitors and slackers at the Ministry of Defense. I'm the man you should go for. I mean, that's
he wants the credit.
He wants the credit, and he also, and here he's got a good point. He also wants the Wagner fighters to get credit too.
Yeah,
I mean, there was a meeting at the Defense Ministry chaired by Shoigu, and Shoigu was talking about all these places that have been captured, and several of them I noticed are places which the Wagner forces have captured. And Shoigu talks about the Russian armed forces. So, I mean, that must annoy Prigozhin. And it's unsurprising that it does. And it, causes all of these flare-ups. But I cannot imagine that the Russians, I can imagine, I think it's most unlikely that the Russians would allow the whole situation in Bakhmut to unravel because of a quarrel between Prigozhin and,
Never
other people in the Russian military leadership.
Yeah.
Oh, here's a little data point that might be interesting. Apparently, Prigozhin is extraordinarily protective of his Wagner guys, and so far as supplying them with the gear, equipment, and being really on top of that because he doesn't want his people to go out unprepared. And as from what I understand, they're the best equipped outfit of all of the Russian forces arrayed in this conflict. And so, there's a credit issue and also a protectiveness issue. But I agree with you completely. It will mean absolutely nothing insofar as the continuation and the success of the Russian armed forces in the conflict.
Absolutely. And they must also quickly add, there must be some resentment as well. I mean, other units must be saying, well, why is Wagner getting everything and not us? So, I mean, it cuts both ways. But I don't think, as I said, this is ultimately a matter of any great significance.
Yeah. John and Angry Warhawk have the same question. So let me just throw it at you guys. Assuming Russia wins the current battle, where is the next target of major significance? And Angry Warhawk says, once Bakhmut falls, will the dam break and will we see the Russian tidal wave roll across the entire Ukraine? Basically, what happens after Bakhmut, I think, is a good way to...
Only the Russians know, and only the Kiev regime knows. I mean, that's my thinking at this time. Brian, do you think that there's an obvious objective that the Russians are going to go for next?
I think they're just going to continue doing what they've been doing all along, this incremental push all along the line of contact. They see places like Bakhmut, and before that, Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. And before that, Mariupol. These were opportunities. This is where it made the most sense at the time. And then after Bakhmut, that's where they're going to go, the place that makes the most sense at that time. They're not going to pick some place that is irrational and then fight their way toward it. Because, again, the whole point is to diminish Ukraine's military as much as possible. And they do that by picking their targets, their objectives very carefully.
And they pick them based on the number of troops there. So if the Kiev regime is actually planning on doing some sort of Zaporozhye offensive, one would reasonably expect them to position their troops there. Would I be right?
Yeah, I think they do have troops ready there for a major offensive.
Absolutely. Can I just give two quotes from Russian officials today? One is from Shoigu, who is the defense minister. He had a meeting at the defense ministry, and he said over the course of it, this is talking about Bakhmut, the liberation of Bakhmut is currently underway. This city is an important center of defense of Ukrainian troops in Donbass. Taking it under control will allow further offensive actions deep into the defense of the armed forces of Ukraine. So I think that essentially confirms what you're saying, Brian, because he's talking about offensive actions deep into the defense of the armed forces of Ukraine. He's not talking about, it seems to me here, a big arrow offensive. You say we will take the advantage of capturing this important center of Ukraine's defenses, and we will continue afterwards to take Ukraine's defenses in Donbass apart. So that's what Shoigu has said, and a man called Belitsky, who is the Russian-appointed governor of Zaporozhye region, the part of Zaporozhye region that the Russians control. He's also been quoted on Russian television today as saying that Russian forces in Zaporozhye have been heavily reinforced and that the forces there are up to strength and in a much better state than they were some months ago. So I think that answers your question, Gonzalo, about Zaporozhye.
Yeah. And by the way, somebody in chat has said, what about Odessa and Transnistria? I personally don't think that the Russians are going to go for it. Brian, I think it was Brian who did a commentary on Transnistria and the ammo depot that's there, that it's basically a poison pill. I do believe you were the one who said that it was basically, or somebody I read, I forgot, frankly, because there's just so much information flowing around. But for the Kiev regime to go after Transnistria, I don't think they have the manpower, and even if they did, the Russian garrison there would just blow up that ammo depot, and it would be a pointless exercise insofar as Kiev regime is concerned. I think that Transnistria thing is just not going to happen. And insofar as an amphibious assault on Odessa, I seriously doubt that would ever happen. Because why blow that manpower to do something that militarily expensive when you could just keep on grinding away as you've been doing for the past year, and eventually it'll fall of its own accord. Brian, would you agree?
Yeah, it goes back to what you said, Gonzalo, about when Ukraine's military fighting capacity collapses entirely, you don't need to go and assault Odessa, because like you said, you have these forces. They will become an occupation force. They're not going to be an assault force. So I think if they do take Odessa, that will be the way they do it. Them fighting their way to Odessa, I think that would be that is a very
Yeah, and I think that insofar as the Russians are concerned, the Russians have probably made the cold-hearted calculation that they're not going to bother with it, because it would just be, logistically a nightmare. The losses would be not catastrophic, but they would be severe, way above the worth of that sliver of land. And if what they're doing is working, don't mess with a good thing when you're winning. That's my thinking.
Yeah. Mark Hewitt, would you compare Bakhmut to Dien Bien Phu or Verdun, or both?
I'll answer that. This is history. Just to explain to people, Verdun, the Battle of Verdun, one of the key battles of the First World War. It was the Germans set out to fight attrition war against the French. They carried out an offensive against Verdun, which was a heavily fortified city under French control near the French front lines. The French were obliged to defend it, and the attrition was terrible. And by the way, the French commander was the man who eventually became Marshal Pétain, who obviously headed the pro-German government in the Second World War. But we won't go there. I think that the German strategy is analogous to that of the Russians today. But there's a fundamental difference, which is that in 1916, the German and Allied forces in Europe the Western Front were relatively matched. So arguably, the Germans also suffered severe attrition at Verdun. And it wasn't just the French. Verdun, by the way, didn't fall. Now, Dien Bien Phu is a completely different battle. That took place in 1953, and it was in Vietnam, North Vietnam. The whole of Vietnam had been a French colony before the Second World War, in the part of the French colony of Indochina. After the Second World War, there was an insurrection there by the Vietnamese, led by a man who the Americans know very well, Ho Chi Minh. He was a communist, leader of the Communist Party of Vietnam. And he led also the independence movement against the French. And what happened over the course of that war was that a French force about the same size as the Ukrainian force in Bakhmut now got surrounded by the Vietnamese in a place called Dien Bien Phu, quite a small place. And the Vietnamese positioned artillery that they got supplied to them by the Chinese and the Russians, and they shelled the French forces. And the battle went on for about 7 months, and it ended in a Vietnamese victory. And so you can see some of the military parallels between these two battles.
Can I read you guys a title that just came in from the New York Times? Pro-Ukrainian group. Pro-Ukrainian group behind Nord Stream explosions. New York Times.
Pro-Ukrainian group behind Nord Stream. You've got to be kidding. You've got
US
to be
That's what
kidding.
came in on Telegram.
No,
I'm seeing the New York Times cover right now.
U.S. government
Intelligence
is a pro-Ukrainian
suggests
group.
pro-Ukrainian group sabotage pipelines, U.S. officials say.
That is just laughable. What?
It's literally true, Gonzalo. I mean, we know their names.
This is
Well,
evidence.
okay, yes, technically, you're right. You're right. You're right. It
This
is
is
a pro-Ukrainian
evidenced by.
group. It is the U.S. military. Oh my
This is
God.
evidenced by new intelligence data that U.S. officials have read. However, there is no evidence that Ukrainian President Zelensky or his top aides were involved in the operation.
I cannot believe that they are
Because it was the
this
Pentagon.
lie. I cannot.
We have to
I'm
double and
looking
triple
at
check
the
this,
article.
but
I'm looking
seeing
at
the
it now.
screenshot
Hang
right
on,
now.
it's coming up. On
I'm
my
looking at
phone.
the New York Times right now.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm looking at it now too because I've got to see this. My internet is snail's pace. Okay, okay. Intelligence suggests pro-Ukrainian group sabotage pipelines. U.S. officials say new intelligence reporting amounts to the first significant known lead about who was responsible for the attack on the Nord Stream pipelines that carried natural gas from Russia to Europe. First paragraph. New intelligence reviewed by U.S. officials suggests that a pro-Ukrainian group carried out the attack on the Nord Stream pipelines last year, a step towards determining responsibility for an act of sabotage that has confounded investigators on both sides of the Atlantic for months. U.S. officials said that they had no evidence President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine or his top lieutenants were involved in the operation. The brazen attack on the natural pipeline. Okay, I'm not going to read anymore because how can you be the chutzpah? I'm sorry. I cannot. I'm sorry. I'm flabbergasted. Please forgive me. Please forgive me for my outburst because this is so insane.
We'll dig into this story. Denitsa wants to know, how exactly do Ukrainians who fled Europe imagine things? In one case, Europe goes to war with Russia on the territory of Ukraine and destroys it. In the other, it expands throughout Europe. Then how far will they flee? To Argentina? Question.
I'm sorry.
I think
I'm still recovering my shock. So Brian, take it away.
Yeah, I think people that fled Ukraine, I think most of them are just ordinary people that just want to get away from the conflict.
Yeah.
It's very you could see what is going on there, and that's just something that I don't think any normal person would want to be, affected by if they had the opportunity to get out. So they did, and I don't know if they're really thinking about. I mean, obviously they're thinking about their own personal future, but I mean, everybody is waiting to see what happens in Ukraine, but you see the state of its infrastructure, the economy. I think even ordinary people can look at that and say,
I can speak of this with some authority because I'm in touch with a lot of diaspora Ukrainians. And, this conflict has gone on for over a year, and a big chunk of them left almost immediately. All right. I mean, the first 30 days, 60 days on the outside. Now, these people have gone to Poland. They've gone a lot to Sweden, Denmark, Germany, Switzerland, and another big chunk have gone to Russia. That's something that people don't report. UN estimates are that something like 14 million Ukrainians fled the country, and something like 3 million of those went to Russia because they have family ties there, and the other 11 million went to Europe. And they're spread around the European continent. They have no intention of coming back because these people fled early in the conflict out of panic. And in the year since, they've settled into jobs, into apartments, into relationships. And so why would they go back? And especially considering the fact that even if the war were to end now, Ukraine is a broken country. So they're not going to have any kind of economic opportunities to advance with their lives. Whereas in Europe, regardless of what the discussion we've been having about the disaster of the European economy, at least it still has a semblance of order and infrastructure that is more or less working in Europe, whereas that is not the case in Ukraine. So that diaspora is never going to return. Or if it were to return, I would suggest less than 20% of those people. Because I think that something that has to be understood is that it's not that they've just gotten a job, but they've also started to form friendships, romantic relationships of various sorts. They're getting established elsewhere. And so, especially the women, I hate to bring this issue up, but the Zelensky regime prevents and has prevented since the outset of this conflict, military-age men, young men, from leaving the country. And so the ones who filtered out were predominantly women. Certainly some of the people who were richer, who were able to bribe the border guards, were able to filter through. But for the most part, they are older people and they are women, professional women. And so they're not going to return to Ukraine because they're settled in the West. And that's why Ukraine as a nation is broken already, irretrievably so.
A question to Brian. Since we can all trust the collective West leadership to tell the truth, when will F-16s be flying into the Ukraine with NATO pilots in uniform?
Ghost of Kiev! Talk about the Ghost of Kiev.
Well, Alex, as you said in a recent video, if F-16s do appear in the skies over Ukraine, it's because NATO pilots are posing as Ukrainian pilots and operating them. The problem is Ukraine had an air force when the special military operation began. Russia destroyed it on the ground with their cruise missiles. They destroyed it in the air with their anti-air defense systems. They have their own military aviation that did and are still shooting down whatever NATO is able to scrape together and send to Ukraine in terms of both helicopters and warplanes and also drones. And so F-16 operating in Ukraine, all that's going to be is more for Russia to shoot down. Where are they going to operate out of? Where are they going to operate where they're not going to be immediately shot down? I mean, these are all really important questions. And I think this is the reason why they've been discussing it. They've been discussing it along with all these other very unrealistic propositions because they want to create the illusion of this massive tidal wave of support they're going to give and continuously give Ukraine. But when you actually analyze it, it's smoke. There's no substance to it.
Yeah. Filipina Traveler TV says, New Atlas, do you think that we will see a bombing campaign at some point? Russian Air Force have only and mostly used Su-25 helicopters and missile strikes.
There actually are reports that Russia is using military aviation around Andreevka, outside Donetsk city. They also have a glide bomb munition that I've seen evidence that they've begun using. So this is a kind of a standoff weapon. They have been using standoff weapons for many attacks. A lot of these cruise missiles are being fired by Russian warplanes. When they start bombing more aggressively and over targets like they had been in Syria, that all comes down to degrading Ukraine's air defense system, which is nearing completion. But when exactly that happens and Russia feels confident, I believe it will happen, but I just don't know when.
Okay.
I have a quick comment because as I've been listening to Brian speak, I also scanned through the article and I want to read a pertinent couple of paragraphs, if you don't mind.
I wanted to go back to it also.
Yeah. Here's the couple of relevant paragraphs. Last month, the investigative journalist, I'm quoting here, last month, the investigative journalist Seymour Hersh published an article on Substack concluding that the United States carried out the operation at the direction of Mr. Biden. In making his case, Mr. Hersh cited the president's pre-invasion threat to bring an end to Nord Stream and similar statements by other senior U.S. officials. U.S. officials say Mr. Biden and his top aides did not authorize a mission to destroy the Nord Stream pipelines, and they say there was no U.S. involvement. All right, but here's the key subsequent paragraph in this New York Times article. Any findings that put blame on Kiev or Ukrainian proxies could prompt a backlash in Europe and make it harder for the West to maintain a united front in support of Ukraine. U.S. officials and intelligence agencies acknowledge that they have limited visibility into Ukrainian decision-making. Despite Ukraine's deep dependence on the United States for military intelligence and diplomatic support, Ukrainian officials are not always transparent with their American counterparts about their military operations, especially those against Russian targets behind enemy lines. These operations have frustrated U.S. officials who believe that they have not measurably improved Ukraine's position on the battlefield, but have risked alienating European allies and widening the war. It reads to me as if they're trying to, that this article was leaked, quote unquote, to the New York Times, and they're trying to lay this blame on Ukraine so that they give a viable excuse for the Europeans to break with Ukraine and have this whole thing kind of like dissolve. That's how I'm reading this. And I think the article on the front page, it's clearly a message from the Biden administration to deflect and say, hey, look over there. Oh, sorry, wrong direction, not at Brian. Look over there. Zelensky regime, they did it. They're the bad guys.
Can I make a comment, what you're saying, Gonzalo, and just get all of your feedbacks? The terror attacks in Bryansk, do you think they have something to do with laying the groundwork for all of this?
Yeah.
And the fact that the media interviewed these guys?
Yeah.
It plays
Yeah.
These crazy Ukrainians, they're doing whatever. They blew up Nord Stream. They shot up some civilians in Bryansk. It's all their fault. We didn't do nothing. I'm sorry, but that's how I'm reading it. Brian, what do you think?
I just wanted to point out in this article, they're specifically blaming, they say it's either Ukrainian or Russian nationals who are sympathetic to Ukraine. Number one, there's no technical possibility that just some random group did this. That is impossible. It had to be a state actor. It was the United States, obviously. Almost exactly as Seymour Hersh laid out. That is how I imagined that it was done, and that is almost certainly how it was done. But this is the United States. They realize that people are starting to wake up to what's going on. Even with their denials, nobody's buying it. And so they're going to throw Ukraine under the bus. They're going to lose the proxy war. They're going to flush everything down the toilet with Ukraine. And I hope people in Kiev are wise to this, because they're going to take the point of a proxy war is to fight it at someone else's expense, their complete expense. There's not going to be a dime left or a drop of blood left in Ukraine.
And they're going to lay it at the feet of Zelensky. And the next article is going to be on the front page of the New York Times. Is going to be talking about Zelensky's corruption and how he's got mansions in Miami and Italy. And it's going to go in that direction. I'm telling you, this is a sign, okay? Because it's too absurd to think that it's just randomly. It's on the front page, top of the page, breaking news. Sorry.
I agree with that entirely. And I think we can also perhaps now understand a little more about the meeting between Biden and Scholz and this very strange meeting, because one of the things that exactly, I mean, this is fun. Can I just say, let's pretend, let's pretend that we believe much of what goes on in this is said in this article, that the United States doesn't really know very much about how Ukraine makes its decisions, that the Ukrainians don't consult and keep the United States informed about how it makes decisions, and it regularly does all sorts of things that the US isn't really very happy with, and which are counterproductive. So is that the country you give hundreds of billions of dollars of arms to, and hundreds of billions of dollars of financial aid to? I mean, in a curious way, this condemns itself. I mean, it shows how utterly deranged US policy itself was, because it's saying straightforwardly here, well, we're supporting an ally who can't be trusted to act rationally. So,
Alexander, let me ask you this question, Alexander, if I may. I mean, first of all, we agree the absurdity of the article. It's just absolutely ridiculous. And everybody who thinks that the Ukrainians did it is just out to lunch, right? So, okay, so this article was clearly planted. It's right on the front page, top of the thing of the New York Times. Do you think that this is the pivot? I mean, it's crazy that we're actually on this live stream when this is coming out, but Do you see this, because I see this as a pivot where the administration is saying, okay, let's get out from this thing and blame it all on Zelensky? I mean, is this the opening salvo in that maneuver?
We can't be absolutely sure, but I have to say it does have that look about it. And we have to be careful.
Sure,
and,
of course.
there may be different forces pulling in different directions. But Biden has an election to win. He wants to win. He wants to be the president. He's seeing a debacle moving in his direction. He's been identified by Seymour Hersh as the man behind the attack on Nord Stream. He's undoubtedly been briefed by his military people as well. That things are not going well for Ukraine. We know all of this. So, there is a kind of political imperative to pivot away. And this does look, Seymour Hersh got it all wrong. Biden is completely innocent.
Zelensky
it was
did
the
it.
crazy Ukrainians. We had that incident with those ultra right-wing
individuals
going into Bryansk.
Russian
I agree.
nationals. Russian nationals.
Russian
Remember that word.
Russian nationals. Exactly.
Remember that word.
I have to hear. I think Alex is absolutely right, because I did wonder why we were suddenly seeing interviews in the British media with these people. Well, it's just a way of telling us now that there are such people, and you can start to see the way this whole pattern is. All the pieces are starting to fall into place. Now, we've got to be careful, because sometimes, there's always a risk of over-organizing things, assuming that, there are these pieces and they do all fit together in the particular pattern that to us seems attractive. And we've got to be careful. Yeah. But it does seem an interest. It's difficult to understand at this moment, this article, in any other way than the one you've just said.
And by the way, in the part that I quoted, they specifically said that they did not think that Zelensky himself was part of this.
Yes, or his top lieutenants. So they're what they're trying to do is flush it down the toilet with someone somewhere in Ukraine, because that, how could you hold them accountable, especially citing something like the attack into Bryansk? They're doing all kinds of things. Zelensky has no control. We have no control. It just has a life of its own. So if anything else happens, we'll just blame it on them, obviously Washington.
Far-right Russian nationals who are upset with Putin's war are the ones that blew up the pipeline.
God damn, this is funny. Perfect. This is funny stuff. I mean, oh my goodness. Because people have the misconception that, of course, these pipelines were just like laying there on the sea bottom. No, they're dug in. They are covered with a layer of sediment. And these pipelines, in order to blow them up, you need hundreds of kilograms of explosives. It's not a simple matter. The only people who could have done it is some major naval power. And which major naval power was conducting exercises right in that area 3 months before the explosion? I mean, come on. It's just laughable to think that, Ukraine, whose entire navy is at the bottom of the Black Sea, had anything to do with this. It's laughable. I can't believe that they floated this. I mean, truly, this is a level of contempt for the New York Times readership that is off the charts. I mean, would you guys agree? I'm sorry for going on this.
But Gonzalo, Biden, I think that there is a point that Alexander made, and we were talking about this in a video we did a couple of days ago. Biden looks like he's going to run.
Oh, yeah.
It looks like he's going to run. And he can't afford another Afghanistan type of debacle. And this would be magnitudes greater than Afghanistan. I mean, he is a few months away from an election cycle, maybe 6 months tops. And he's got to start, gearing up and campaigning and getting all that stuff underway. And so what are his options? His options are either to continue to dig into Ukraine, which is becoming more unpopular with the American people. Sending more money is becoming more unpopular. He either has to hope for some sort of breakthrough, the spring offensive, and it gives them some sort of breakthrough, and then he can leverage that to some sort of negotiated victory or whatever, or he has to find a way out.
I'm sorry. Alex, I completely agree with everything that you're saying. Okay, please don't get me wrong. Well,
I'm
certainly not
actually
like
for your
you.
feedback, for you and Brian's and Alexander's feedback. That's the way I'm looking at it, because I'm saying
I would agree.
time is
think
running out for the Biden White
Yeah,
House
I
from a
would
political
completely agree.
standpoint, from a
Yeah.
campaign standpoint.
And so what we'll have to see is if this is just a trial balloon in terms of propaganda, or if this is a start of a real campaign to blame it all on the crazy Ukrainians, and we should just dissociate ourselves from the entire conflict.
No,
and
not
just no harm, no
Ukrainians,
foul.
Russian nationals. That's the
Well,
Russian.
I think that kind of like complicates the issue. It muddies the waters in terms of media
True.
spin.
That's also true.
Okay. And so I think it's just easier for them to say, oh, it's the crazy Ukrainians there. They actually are, the Azov and right sector. They really are these crazy neo-ends. So, it's them. It's not Zelensky, because he's our guy. And we're going to have to save him. Maybe this is part of some arrangement that they'll blame it all on the people below Zelensky and save Zelensky himself. Because in terms of Zelensky, they've invested so much in his persona as this modern day, later day Winston Churchill figure, that I don't think it would fly if they threw him under the bus. And so it could be that they're going to blame it all on the people below and say that these crazies below him are the ones that perhaps is the reason he had to flee Kiev for the West. Perhaps. I don't know. Look, it's all too crazy, but I'm truly and honestly stunned. I'm not usually this flabbergasted by an article, but the headline alone is just so laughable to anybody who's been paying attention to even a little bit to this conflict. I just find it stunning.
That desperation, that's what it is.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it looks to me like a story that's been cobbled together in a huge hurry after Seymour Hersh's piece, to be honest. I mean, that's what it looks to me
But the
like.
piece came out 2 months ago,
Yeah, I mean, but that isn't a long, that you need to come up with a response. And I think if you're going to do it, you're going to do it. This is the way you would do it. And I think it does take time to get all the bits together. It's been covered by the British media, but not, by the way, very much. The British media is downplaying this New York Times piece.
What do you make, guys, about the Bild going after Zelensky so hard?
No,
they're not stupid,
Well, it could also be part of what has been said, that this is another way of starting to pivot away from Zelensky. Yeah. My own personal view about all of these things is that we are still in a situation at the moment where there are different voices pulling in different directions. And I think that's an important thing to say. And that there's still bureaucratic and intra-elite and political conflicts going on. There are some people, the uniformed military, are not keen on this. I suspect some of the people in the bigger, the finance side of the economy, the economics people are not keen on this adventure. Others are deeply committed to it. And there's the Democratic Party in the United States, which is its own electoral interests to worry about. And then there are the more ideological figures within the media and within the administration itself who still want to keep this war going. So I think there's a lot of push and pull going on. And I think, you also got to think of these sort of articles, the Bild Zeitung article, the New York Times article, which we've just been talking about, as manifestations, if you like, of these constant conflicts that are taking place. But I think its primary purpose is to bury Seymour Hersh, if I have to be honest. I think that's what it's principally aimed to do.
I would agree.
The conclusion would be now the U.S. is not opposed to rebuilding the Nord Stream pipeline, which begs the question, did Schultz give Biden his red lines?
No, I think Germany is going to do whatever the U.S. requires of it, no matter how much damage. I mean, they already have. They are already giving up Germany's future. They already have, and they will continue to do so. I see no one in Germany that is standing up in any significant, substantial way to the U.S. And unfortunately, I think that is going to be the whole of Europe that does that, and I don't think there's any end in sight until this whole project comes to an end.
You gotta believe that Seymour Hersh has more stuff up his sleeve with his reporting on Nord Stream. Correct?
Yes.
Possibly.
I'm sure he does. But as I said, this is the problem Hersh has, and as we've seen, is that he has difficulty getting his story circulated. Now, he's been able to do it up to a certain point because he's been functioning in a vacuum, because the administration hasn't responded. Now they've come up with a story. It may be an utterly ridiculous one, but it provides an alternative narrative to the one that Hersh has provided. And, if you back into the world of postmodernism, narrative creations, that kind of thing, you can understand the strategy very well. I mean, bear in mind, if we go back to 2016 with the election, you had the actual facts about how Hillary Clinton sabotaged Bernie Sanders' campaign. Mm-hmm. And then you had the absolutely fantastical story that it was all part of some giant conspiracy between the Kremlin and a virtual TV star and construction magnate to steal the presidential election. And the media went along with the second and buried the first. So you can see some of that at play here.
By the way, I just did a quick global search of the New York Times website. This is the first mention of Seymour Hersh since 2015. The first mention of his reporting. So that's pretty indicative, I think. Jesus, man. There's this famous phrase from Apocalypse Now: the bullshit piles up so fast, you need wings to stay above it. Well, here you go. I mean, it's just unbelievable. I mean, it truly is remarkable. And to your point, Alexander, you're absolutely right. Between something very reasonable that the Hillary Clinton campaign torpedoed Bernie Sanders and the fantastical Trump and the Kremlin did it, they went with the crazy story. Oh, my goodness. My goodness.
And it worked.
Yeah.
And it worked, yeah.
And they primed the population for the upcoming proxy war with Russia all at the same time.
Correct.
Well, why didn't they blame the Chinese for the Nord Stream pipeline? Wouldn't that
they're gonna. Don't worry. Don't worry. They've got all kinds of stories. The balloon was just the beginning.
Absolutely, agree.
The $12 balloon that was Chinese intelligence. Oh yeah.
Oh man. All right, let's wrap it up there, guys. Sure. I think we've got a lot of research to do now. a lot of digging into.
I'm just going to go and sit and laugh as I read the New York Times article because it's just too absurd.
I think the same.
Yeah,
I think I need a strong Scotch after this one to be honest, to try and sort of settle down.
Yeah.
So we'll do a dedicated Q&A to answer the remaining questions. Thank you to everybody that asked us questions. Thank you to everybody that joined us on this live stream. Thank you to our moderators, Valies, Reckless Abandon, Zariel is in the house. Who else was with us? William Justice as well. And I think that's
let me give a shout out to Zariel and Reckless Abandon, who are both mods on my channel. Thank you guys so much for modding. Appreciate it.
Fantastic. Thank you, guys. Thank you to all the questions. Thank you to everyone that watched us on Rockfin, Odyssey, Rumble, theduran.locals.com, and YouTube. And thank you to Gonzalo Lira and Brian Berletic. I will have their information in the description box down below and as a pinned comment. Thank you to Alexander Mercouris. Any final thoughts, gentlemen, before we sign off?
Well, I think we had the most extraordinary live stream because at the very end, I mean, this sort of thing exploded on us out of nowhere. But at least this way, this has been a tremendous bonus because we've all had an instant, immediate response to this extraordinary story. But it's been a great live stream altogether, and I think we've all learned a lot from it, and it's always great to share and pool views.
My final thought is... Oh, I'm sorry, Brian, please.
No, I was just gonna say, the West, the United States, they're out of good options. I don't think they've had any good options for a long time, and all that is left are worse and worse options. We have to be aware of that and be very keep our eyes open for anything that comes along. And I just want to thank you, Alex and Alexander, for having me on. And as always, Gonzalo, it's a pleasure.
I want to thank both Alex and Alexander for having me on. Brian, it's always a pleasure. And I just want to say that seeing this article appear in the New York Times, I am increasingly convinced that at some point in maybe 2000 or 2001, we exited our actual universe into the multiverse, but this multiverse is a clown verse. It's just ridiculousness piled on ridiculousness, piled on ridiculousness, because this doesn't make any sense for any thinking adult. God is playing a giant joke on us. And I just want God to end this joke already. Hit us with the punchline, because this is too ridiculous. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Peter, also for moderating. Well said, Alexander. Well said, Brian, Alexander. Everybody that's watching us, take care. Have a good morning, day, or evening, wherever you are in the world.